Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Royal United Services Institute for this Real Dialogue event. The Real Dialogue is a volunteer-based, not-for-profit organisation created to host the best speakers in the best locations to cover important topics in an engaging and informative way for a world free from dogma, prejudice and irrational belief. If you have any feedback on tonight's event, you'll find a feedback form on your chair, and we've got some pens in the foyer for you to leave feedback for us. It's most welcome. Our topic tonight is atheism or belief, which is evidence-based. What are the processes by which we can understand whether God exists or not? And does science have any say in the matter? Does religious scripture offer unequivocal evidence of the divine? We hope to find answers to these questions and more tonight. You can follow and contribute to the dialogue on Twitter with the hashtag #atheismOrBelief. And now to introduce our chair. Our event tonight is chaired by Catrin Nye. Catrin is a reporter and documentary maker for BBC News with a special focus on issues affecting Britain's diverse communities. Her most recent documentaries looked at the rise of the far right in Germany, mixed faith marriage, and 2 documentaries in which she travelled on aid convoys in Syria. Catrin has worked for the BBC since she was 19, moving from local radio to national and now into television. Please welcome our chair for tonight, Catrin Nye.
So we're here today not to argue, but to discuss, to have a dialogue, and hopefully, if not change, at least challenge some of our own opinions. I remember when the Charlie Hebdo attack happened in Paris, and everyone quickly took to Twitter to express initially generally their horror, but quickly their opinion on what the attack meant. And for those that thought all Muslims were terrorists, this confirmed just that. For those that thought France was a hotbed of Islamophobia, this confirmed that too. For people who thought we needed more freedom of speech, well, this confirmed that. And for those that thought we desperately needed a crackdown on freedom of speech, this was their proof. There was so much opinion, so many people reaffirming what they already believed to be true, and what seemed like far less examples of people opening their minds a little to see if they could learn something new from such a terrible tragedy. Then, of course, people went on to read articles and opinions to solidify those opinions. This is narrowcasting, receiving only information that confirms what you already believe, the opinions that you hold dear and that don't challenge you and don't shake you. And that's hopefully quite ambitiously what today's event is not. We're here to listen to the person that we don't necessarily think's right, the person whose views push us outside our comfort zone a little and maybe make us question why we believe what we do. They won't be shouted down, but listened to and probed by their opponent and hopefully by you. The question is atheism or belief, which is evidence-based. Now, a few people I've mentioned this to have said the answer is really simple, neither. But that doesn't make for a very interesting discussion. So we're going to try and take it a little further than that. This is a subject of great personal interest to me. I spend a huge amount of my time with people who believe, people who have faith, and people who talk to me really personally, both on and off camera, about why they have that faith. But I also spend a lot of time with people who think those believers that I spend a lot of time with are wrong. And they want to tell me just as vehemently why they think they're wrong. And I really like listening to both those groups of people, but I do think maybe they should listen to each other a little bit more. We have 2 speakers representing those 2 groups, prominent atheist Arif Ahmed, a senior lecturer at Cambridge University, and Ayyaz Mahmood, a scholar of comparative religion from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. We'll have 20 minutes from each of the speakers, then around 20 minutes of discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. And at the very end, we'll have a minute from these guys again to hopefully sum up really succinctly what they have to say on this. So the first of our speakers is Arif Ahmed. Arif studied mathematics at Oxford University and philosophy at Sussex and Cambridge. He's worked at Birmingham University and Sydney University and is now a senior lecturer in philosophy at Cambridge. He writes mainly on decision theory, which is about how people do and how they should make decisions in the face of adversity. He also has an interest in religion and has debated the subject against William Lane Craig, Tariq Ramadan, Rowan Williams, and others. He's an atheist and a libertarian. So Arif will start.
You will hear me? Yeah, all right, thanks. Well, I'd just like to start by thanking Hugh Wyeth and all the organisers of this event for their hospitality, thanking Catrin and thanking Ayyaz as well for taking part, and to thank all of you for coming. I'm looking forward to this discussion. The topic we're discussing tonight is whether evidence supports religion or atheism. And I think I should maybe just start by saying that we're not discussing any of various other topics with which this might be confused. For one thing, we're not discussing the question of whether religion answers a deep need inside the human soul, or whether religion makes us better people if we believe it, or whether religion is good even for unbelievers, if there are people around who believe in religion. These are all interesting and worthwhile questions on which there's a good deal to say, and we may indeed talk about them a little bit later on tonight. But they are not the question which is up for discussion. The question is whether religion is supported by the evidence. The other thing that I would say is that when I'm talking about religion, I don't mean something metaphorical. That is to say, I don't mean interpretations of religious claims so that they're drained of any supernatural content and become merely metaphors for this, that, or the other. Just about any false claim can be taken as a metaphorical expression of a truth of one sort or another. But I think some of the most important things about religion are lost if we interpret it in purely metaphorical terms. For instance, if you think that religion is one of the sources of comfort in the face of death, either of one's own death or the death of people that you love, it's not possible to be comforted, or not so easy to be comforted, by a metaphor. What makes the difference is genuine belief, for instance, in an afterlife. Similarly, if you think that religion is something that motivates people to behave well towards one another, or is something that makes us good in other ways, you might think it's more plausible to suppose that people do that because they genuinely believe that they're following their duty as God laid it down, rather than simply acting in accordance with one or another metaphor. So I won't be concerned so much with a metaphorical interpretation of religion or of scripture, though of course we might discuss that later, but rather with the literal truth of religious claims, to which indeed I believe that Ayyaz and many other religious adherents, Islamic and otherwise, would subscribe. Now, the question as to what the content of religious claims are is itself one that has as many answers as there are religions. There are maybe, 4,000 religions, something like that, in the world. Everyone here agrees, presumably, that at least 3,999 of those religions are not supported by the evidence and are indeed false, and in some cases misleading and wicked. But some of us believe that all 4,000 such religions are not supported by the evidence. The reason that I mentioned the multiplicity of religions is simply to highlight the difficulty of isolating what specific religious claims are supposed to be. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to identify them with what I take to be the common belief of all Muslims, and certainly something that would probably be believed by most monotheists, so by Muslims, Christians, and Jews, which is that there is an intelligent, benevolent, and powerful entity that created the universe. This entity is the sole bearer of moral authority and the source of all political legitimacy. And this entity will judge all of us at the end of the world, all of us who are alive now, all of us who are now dead, and indeed all people who are yet to be born, and will mete out rewards or punishments in accordance with his judgment. Now, obviously, there's a good deal more to Islam and to other religions than that, but at the very least, I think we could take the literal truth of that claim to be something we could fairly identify with religion for the purposes of the present discussion. Perhaps we might weaken it in one or another way, or there might be strengthenings of it that we might be interested in discussing later, but for present purposes, I will be discussing that interpretation of the claim. Now, if we want to answer the question, how does the evidence bear on the truth or falsity of this claim, we need to have a clear conception of what it is for evidence to speak in favour of or against something. And we do, I think, have a relatively clear conception of how evidence bears on any particular claim, which is as follows. If you want to know if you've got any particular bit of evidence, any observation that you've made, for instance, and you want to know whether the evidence is in favour of some hypothesis or against a hypothesis, you have to ask two questions. The first question is, how likely is it that we would have observed this evidence if the hypothesis was true? And then the second question is, how likely is it that we would have observed this evidence if the hypothesis is false? Now, the evidence, whatever it is that you've observed, is then grounds for believing the hypothesis to the extent that the first quantity exceeds the second quantity. So if you have some evidence that's very likely to have occurred if a certain hypothesis is true, but very unlikely to have occurred if that hypothesis is false, then that gives you strong reasons, the evidence gives you strong reasons for accepting the hypothesis. And that's what I mean, in abstract terms, that's what I mean when I say that the evidence supports something. Let me give you an example. Suppose, for instance, that you're testing a drug and you want to know whether the drug is efficacious or not in killing some kind of infection or curing people of a certain kind of disease. And we do tests, and we find that, as a matter of fact, in double-blind controlled trials, we find that a very large proportion, say 95% of people who are treated with the drug recover, and only 10%, let's say, or 1% of people who are not treated with the drug recover. And we can ask ourselves, how likely is that to have happened just by chance if the drug wasn't efficacious? And how likely is it to have arisen if the drug was efficacious? And the answer is that those observations would have been ones we would expect to have if the drug had worked, but they're not observations we would have expected. They would have been very unlikely if the drug had not worked. So that's an illustration of the method that I have in mind. You ask the two questions: how likely is it that we would have had this evidence if the hypothesis, in this case that the drug works, is true? How likely is it that we would have had this evidence, in this case the hypothesis that the drug works, if that had been false? And in this example, with the numbers that I gave you, the first quantity exceeds the second by a great deal. So it seems as though we've got the evidence does indeed bear very positively on that supposition. Now, I didn't choose the example of the drug completely at random. The reason that I mention it is, of course, because with drugs, just as with many other things on which our lives depend, we do indeed pay very close attention to what the evidence is in something like the manner that I've described. So we don't just buy drugs on blind faith, or we don't just buy drugs because it makes us feel good, or because we think it'll make us nice people, or because it answers to a deep need in the human soul, or something like that. We don't buy drugs for those reasons. We buy them because the evidence tells us that they work in the manner that I've described. And if you're religious, and perhaps even if you're not, you might think that the question as to whether or not to believe religious claims and whether or not to center your life around some such claim as the one that I started out by mentioning, you might think that that sort of claim is even more important, vastly more important, than the question of whether you should take this or that drug, or whether you should get on a plane, or any of the many other things to which we trust our lives every day. Because after all, if you do believe these religious claims, then you must think they're the most important claims in the world. They're not only your present life, but also your future life and eternity will depend upon them, and not only that, but also the salvation of the human race and the meaning of all our lives depends upon them. So this is perhaps the most important question that anybody could ever ask themselves, and therefore it's one to which I think, if we're consistent, we ought to be especially stringent in our application of the methods of evidence that I just described, just as we are in other life or death questions, such as whether to take a drug. Okay, so if we ask those two questions, we can consider, for particular bits of evidence, exactly what their bearing is on the claims of religion. I'm going to talk about 3 bits of evidence. If there's time towards the end, I'll say a little bit more, but I'm going to concentrate what I say now on 3 particular kinds of evidence. In a way, speaking first puts me in a slightly difficult position because I don't know what evidences Ayyaz is going to cite, so I can't respond to them or say what I think of them. But I'm going to mention 3 particular kinds of evidence that seem to have a positive or negative bearing on the claims of religion and give an assessment of what that bearing is. The first sort of evidence, which is one that one hears most frequently cited in discussions with proponents of religion, of Islam, for instance, is the existence of scripture itself, the existence of Quranic scripture. We do indeed have the Quran, as it's come down to us since the 7th century, and that does indeed make claims about its own divine source and the nature of the divinity, including claims that entail the things that I said earlier on and which I identified with religion. And so what we have to ask about that evidence is, does the existence of these texts and the claims that these texts make constitute strong positive evidence in favour of their truth? Well, the questions we have to ask then is, how likely is it that we would have observed this if Islam had been true? And how likely is it that we would have observed it if Islam had been false? Now, of course, if the central claims of Islam are true, then it's very likely that we would have observed something like the Quran. After all, the central claim of the Quran is that there's only one God and that He revealed His message to Muhammad through an angel, and that message was then supposed to be propagated around the world. And indeed, that is what happened. So it's what we would expect to happen, at least in its initial stages, the initial stages of the religion. It's what we would expect to happen if the Islamic doctrine were correct. But it seems to me that it's also something that we would expect to happen if Islam were false. If there were no God, if there were no divine revelation to Muhammad, if the whole thing was some sort of delusion or some kind of fraud, then we would expect to observe just the sorts of things that we do in fact observe. My reason for thinking this is that, of course, we have a very large number of supposed divine revelations to individuals which everyone agrees are false. We all agree, for instance, that, well, I hope we all agree that Joan of Arc was hearing voices. She didn't actually have a hotline to God when she heard the voices in her head. Or the priestess of the Temple of Diana, going backwards in history rather than forwards in history, in antiquity. Or if we think about the person in Bristol who smothered his own grandmother recently because he heard voices from God. These are all instances of people who claim divine revelation, who claim to have heard a message from God, and who acted on it, in those cases presumably in all sincerity. But of course we all agree that they weren't hearing anything of the sort, and the claims that they made were false. So the mere existence of Scripture, that is, the mere existence of a body of texts that makes these claims, is something that we shouldn't be very surprised to see whether or not the claims are true. So it's not as though this is something that that is especially unlikely or difficult to explain, given the falsity of the religious hypothesis. That was the first bit of evidence, that I was going to consider. Second bit of evidence that I want to consider is a related one, but one that people sometimes bring up, which is to do with the existence of belief, of religious belief. Islam is indeed a widespread religion. More than 1 billion people believe it, many of them very devoutly, and the devoutness of people's adherents is perhaps something that you would expect to find if the religion's claims were true. But of course, again, it's also something that you would expect to find if the claims were false. Note the distinction between the kind of evidence I'm talking about now and the kind of evidence that I just mentioned. This is not to do with the existence of Scripture, this is to do with the existence of belief. It may be that this is the sort of evidence that's cited more frequently by a certain type of Christian than it is by Muslim scholars. Nevertheless, it can be regarded as a kind of indirect, but I think fairly weak, evidence for the truth of religion. Now again, just as in the first case, we shouldn't be very surprised to find people holding false beliefs. We shouldn't be very surprised to find very widespread and very devout belief in religion, even if the claims of that religion were false. There are spectacular examples of this. Of course, spectacular examples don't just include all the world religions except for the favoured one or the favoured few, which we all agree are false. Particularly spectacular examples include, for instance, something like Jonestown. Okay, so the sort of Christian revivalist come socialist movement that existed in Guyana in the late 1970s, which consisted of, about 1,000 US citizens who moved to South America to start up their own quasi-religious cult, where they all lived together, and then, as you all know, the end was disastrous. They all committed mass suicide because they thought the United States was going to destroy them. This is a case where people had not only false but dangerously false beliefs. But the point I want to make now is not so much the falsity of their beliefs, but the devoutness with which they were held. That is to say, these were beliefs that all of these people were willing not only to risk, but actually to sacrifice their lives for these beliefs. And yet no sensible third person thinks for a moment that they were anything more than a tissue of deception. So it's not, that's just one example of many that we could give. But the main point is that it's hardly surprising, again, that you would find devout belief in a variety of false things. And so the falsity of the Islamic doctrine, the falsity of Judaism, or the falsity of Christianity is not only consistent with, but makes it hardly surprising that they should exist. Very wide and very strongly held beliefs in these doctrines. The third bit of evidence that I want to think about, so the two bits of evidence that I've discussed so far, one of them is scripture and the other one is the existence of religious belief. These are both bits of evidence for religion. The third bit of evidence that I want to think about is to do with, is a bit of evidence that is against religion. And this is nothing new. Okay? This is the argument concerning the existence of evil. We know that there is in the world gratuitous evil, that is, if anything is evil, these things are evil. These things are bad and wrong, that are both gratuitous and natural. They may not be committed by human beings. They may have nothing to do with free will. They may seem to do no good whatever to anyone, and yet nevertheless they exist. And not only do they exist, but they characterize the condition of the human race for almost the entirety of its history. To take one example, every year 500,000 children die in Africa because of malaria. On the hypothesis that God is not only powerful enough to create the universe, but also largely benevolent, this is not something that we should expect to see. It's quite the opposite of what we should expect to see. This is a well-known argument. This is the argument from evil. On the hypothesis that there is no God, what would we expect to see? Well, we would expect to see a world consisting of random disasters in which people die for apparently no reason, of meaningless suffering characterizing large parts of human existence, perhaps of people being wicked to one another, with occasional islands of civilization and kindness. That's what we should expect to see if we didn't think there was any divine plan that was ordering either the constitution of the universe or the history of the world. And that is indeed what we observe. So in this particular case, it seems, in this particular bit of evidence, seems to be something that would be very likely, or at least hardly surprising, on the hypothesis that religion is false, but seems to be perhaps not only surprising, but even impossible on the hypothesis that religion, as I've characterized it, is true. So that third bit of evidence is, I think, evidence that speaks strongly against religion. Now, as I said, there's maybe other points of evidence that Ayyaz would like to bring up, and I hope we can discuss them as well in the discussion and in the Q&A. But those central points of evidence, it seems to me, speak very strongly in favour of the claim that the evidence not only does not support religion, but actually supports irreligion. How am I doing for time, Catrin? 1 minute, okay. I just want to say a couple of things at the end. The first thing I want to say is that I don't want people to get the impression that I myself have merely substituted one faith, namely Islam or Christianity, for another faith, namely blind faith in science, as though there was such a thing. One way in which I can express my opposition to that idea is that I can give you a list of fairly clear and testable and precise things that would convince me that some form of religion was true. Suppose, for instance, that earthquakes have been predicted all over the world on a specific date in the Quran, and that they did occur, and that there was no explanation of this. That would very strongly raise my confidence in religion. To take Hume's example, suppose that there was a voice that spoke from the clouds, and that each person heard in his own language, but which said the same thing, and that there was no explanation for this. That would be very strong testable evidence for religion. I could multiply the list indefinitely, but there is a vast number of things that I'm pretty confident we won't observe, but if we did observe them, that would be evidence for religion. So it's not blind faith in irreligion. It's faith it's belief that's based on empirical evidence. Indeed, I think it might be worthwhile to turn the challenge around and ask the religious person, well, what sort of evidence would convince you that you were wrong? How bad do things have to get before you actually start thinking, yes, this is evidence against the truth of Islam? If you'd asked somebody for instance, in the golden age of Islam, somebody in the year 1015, let's say, so 1,000 years ago, what sort of evidence would convince you that the Islamic religion was false? He might say, well, if in 1,000 years' time we still hadn't conquered Europe, and Islam was still largely confined to North Africa, the Middle East, and certain parts of Asia, and if the European and the Christian countries had created vast empires and advanced in science, and if the most powerful country in the world was founded on a secular constitution, if he said that's the kind of thing I can imagine somebody in the year 1015 saying would be really strong evidence that actually I was wrong. And of course that sequence of events should be fairly familiar to all of you. So I suppose that's one question that I want to ask, is what kind of evidence would change your mind? Okay, so I'll finish now.
10 seconds.
Okay. But now I look forward to hearing whether there's any other sort of evidence that might settle the case in a way that I don't expect. And I also look forward to the discussion and the Q&A. So thanks very much.
So, thank you, Arif. Thank you very much. Our second speaker will be Ayyaz Mahmood Khan. Ayyaz spent 7 years at the International Theological College of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in London, where he studied the Oriental languages of Persian, Arabic, and Urdu, as well as comparative religion, specializing in colonial South Asian polemic literature of the 19th century. As a broadcaster, Ayyaz has produced and presented more than 50 television programs focusing on the interplay of modern society and religion. He's given lectures at UCL and Imperial College in areas of Sharia and the Islamic concept of the Caliphate. Thank you, Ayyaz.
Catrin, thank you very much. Dr. Arif, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I'm very pleased to be here and really looking forward to a good discussion this evening. So I don't intend to deliver a 20-minute sermon and force my convictions upon anybody. All I intend to do is give you some food for thought and have you make your own choices and decide for yourself whether the evidence which is usually demanded as proof of God's existence, whether that evidence is appropriate and whether it is in line with the objective that's being sought. Because we all know that there are different forms of evidence and each can be equally acceptable, depending on the circumstances, of course. So what kind of evidence is there for the existence of God, if any? But before I get to that, I'd like to just make an observation that I feel as if the topic for today's event is somewhat peculiar. in the sense that what is belief? If we define belief as accepting a thing without evidence, i.e. blind belief, then that's something which has no place in my life as a theist, and the Quran doesn't allow blind belief. But if belief means the acceptance of a thing as being true, but without having the ability to directly observe that thing, then that's something which atheists and theists hold in common, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But secondly, how do we classify evidence? Is a thing evidence-based only if it can be measured by material means or physical apparatuses? It is often suggested that theists are essentially irrational for believing in a being which cannot be touched, which cannot be heard with the ears or seen with the physical eyes. But the fact of the matter is that all of us, whether we are theists or atheists, believe in a whole host of things as being true without being able to directly observe them with our sensory organs. That doesn't make it any less true. I mean, dark matter and dark energy is something that scientists talk of greatly, and I'm not a scientist, but I understand that it makes up a vast majority of the universe, yet there is no way to directly observe dark matter and dark energy. And then if we also take into account the fact that fear, pain, love, anger, these are emotions which cannot be gauged by any of the five senses. Are we all mad for believing in these things? Of course not, because although these things are inaccessible to our sensory organs directly, it is absolutely rational to deduce their existence from the things which we can observe. And evidence for God is no different. A belief in God too is verifiable through clear and evident signs in the world around us, and I will talk about that. But on a personal level, when I think about this, I feel that, and I trust that everyone can appreciate this that perhaps 99% of all of the things that we hold to be true based on testimonial evidence. And we have not tried or tested those things directly for ourselves. For example, we spend our entire lives considering a certain individual to be our fathers, all on the testimony of one woman, our beloved mothers. And I've never heard that intellectual maturity demands that our fathers produce DNA reports for us first before we reassure ourselves of their identities. You just accept it because trust is part of the human fabric. Now, let's talk about science. Even scientists base their entire life's work on the findings of other people. We all take a plethora of things to be common knowledge, despite the fact that we have not tried and tested even a fraction of these for ourselves. We do this because we accept that the testimony of so many people who are reliable and who are experts in their field is also a form of evidence. And it is enough to make it entirely rational to believe in the plausibility of these things. And in the least, it warrants a genuine search, a serious investigation. Similarly, in the case of God, there has always been an enormous amount of like testimony in all ages amongst nations that have never even spoken to one another, which had no contact whatsoever. And this concept of a single supreme being exists, an abstract God which cannot be physically described, exists amongst all of these people. That resemblance is striking and at least warrants a genuine search, as I mentioned. So, intellectual integrity demands that a multiplicity of testimony in every age by those who are known to be sane, firmly grounded in reason, wise and honest, cannot be written off in a single stroke. In the least, we have to investigate it. And that's the case with hypotheses in science as well, right? Now, it is often said that scientific findings can be reproduced. They can be verified through repeated experimentation. But that doesn't change the fact that the people who do these repeated tests are still only a small minority of experts. The vast majority of people still accept the discoveries of science based on trust. So, why should it be any different with God? Now, let's put that to one side. Even forget that for a moment. The fact is that the evidence for God is verifiable too, so long as one demands an appropriate form of evidence. And Scripture says that our search must be according to the objective that's being sought. It has to be appropriate. I mean, someone who says that the smell of a rose ought to be heard, or the taste of sugar ought to be seen, or a beautiful voice ought to be tasted, would be dubbed as stark raving mad. I mean, there's different ways that we test everything to know its existence. And in the case of God, God is not a physical being, so it can't be tested by physical. God can't be tested by physical means either. But there is a method that we can test God and find proof of his existence. And in a way, evidence for religion is more widely accessible to everyone, because whereas I know I could never learn enough mathematics to teach math at a university, and many people don't have it within them to become a physicist to test the intricacies of scientific discoveries, because everyone has their own interests. But anybody, even if they're unlettered, can experience God, so long as they use the correct method to find him. Now, when we talk about this issue of what is the evidence for God, most people simply state that they simply present philosophical argumentation, like the argument of causality or fine-tuning, or the cosmological argument, this, that, and the other. And I'm not going to present a single one of those arguments in favor of God's existence, and have you believe that they're conclusive evidence for the existence of God, because quite frankly, I don't think they are. Philosophical argumentation at most, which is speculative in nature, brings us to the degree of knowledge that perhaps he exists. Maybe there's reasonable cause to postulate the existence of a creator, but it doesn't conclusively prove that he exists. And this form, philosophical argumentation, can be likened to an individual who sees smoke from a distance and infers that there's probably a fire there without seeing the fire himself. It's the lowest form of evidence. It's still inference. It's still speculative. Now, what do I consider to be evidence of God's existence then? And that is revelation, the fulfillment of prophecies. Because if God is not dead, if he is a living God, then he ought to express himself. How can there be any evidence of his existence if he does not communicate with us? I mentioned earlier that testimony for the existence of God is present in all ages, since time immemorial, even in isolated regions that had no contact with one another, and the concept of God is similar throughout all of these nations. I believe that it was prophets of God who are always commissioned to bring guidance from on high, and through various other means, establish the existence of God through the power of prophecy, as Arif mentioned. Because prophecy can be objectively analyzed by everyone. Because if an individual foretells of an event prior to its occurrence, and it is established that the information given is beyond the scope of the available data to that person, and if the prophecy is not so vague that it's completely unfalsifiable and could be applied to every situation you could think of, then that would demonstrate to me that is evidence of an all-knowing God who gave that information to the prophet in advance. And that establishes the existence of God. Now, in every age, these prophets of God have always demonstrated the existence of God through prophecy, whether it was prophets such as Abraham, Confucius, Buddha, Krishna, Lao Tzu, Socrates, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, peace be on all of them, all of whom claim to be divinely commissioned. All of these people came in different parts of the world to bring the message of God. I believe that. And they all brought a single message from a single source. Although there are countless examples throughout history of fulfilled prophecy, I would like to mention two, because prophecy, as I mentioned, is one step further. And it goes beyond just seeing the smoke and inferring a fire. It's like seeing the fire with your own eyes, because you can objectively analyze and test its truth or validity. The first example is one of 1400 years ago. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, foretold that in the distant future, a time would come when camels would be abandoned as a means of swift transport. One may ask then that what was going to replace these forms of transport which were being used in the desert since time immemorial. And the Prophet of Islam described the emergence of a donkey that would be like no other. A donkey which must have seemed so fantastical to the people of that age, but now we can all realize and understand what was being referred to. Regarding this donkey, the Prophet of Islam said, and I quote, "People would climb into its belly from the openings on its side. Its belly would be well lit from within and would be equipped with comfortable seating. The donkey would move at exceptionally fast speeds, covering long distances in a matter of days or hours. It would have regular stoppages on the way, and at every stoppage, the public would be invited to come and be seated before it resumes its journey. And every departure would be loudly announced. Not only this," and I quote, "this donkey would consume fire, and this fire would burn in its belly, but those seated in the donkey's belly would be fully insulated from that fire." However, the prophecy does not end there. The Prophet of Islam also said that when this donkey was required to travel by sea, it would swell to enormous sizes and move from continent to continent and would carry mountains of food on its back across the oceans. But this donkey would not only travel by land and sea, it was also mentioned 1400 years ago, and I quote, that this donkey would move in the air at an altitude higher than that of the clouds, and that it would roam the sky like a cloud driven by wind, and the width between its ears would be 40 meters approximately. I leave it to you to decide for yourself what modern day development is being referred to here, and should let you reflect how a man in 7th century Arabia who was unable to read or write, could have drawn such a vivid picture of a world over a millennium away, if not by revelation from an all-knowing God. Because he couldn't have concocted these things or thought of a grand scheme and made these ideas up, considering the fact that they're pretty descriptive. The question is now that does God still speak in the present age, or do theists speak of only what is past? In this day and age, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, also claimed to be a prophet of God, whose purpose, like all the past prophets, was to prove the existence of God through the power of prophecy and through divine signs. One famous example from among countless fulfilled prophecies comes from 1905, when he publicized what he said was divine revelation warning of an impending global calamity, unparalleled in its ferocity. The prophecy was regarding World War I. Now, numerous characteristics of this prophecy were mentioned in advance and were publicized well in advance in periodicals, and all of them were fulfilled in letter and spirit. Firstly, it was mentioned that the calamity would be global in its scope and was to bring about a revolution in the world, changing the international politic fabric as we knew it. And the prophecy said, and I quote, "A revolution in the world would be brought about." And it also says, and I quote, "The terror of it will exhaust everyone, great and small." Now, everyone knows that the First World War was the first truly global conflict which resulted in the collapse of 4 major empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, Russian, and Ottoman empires, and changed the political makeup of our world as we know it. Secondly, it was also mentioned in the prophecy, and I quote, "Suddenly a calamity will shake them all." So this demonstrates that the calamity was going to be sudden. And we all know that the First World War was sparked by the sudden assassination of the then heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, which is at a contrast to how usually wars start. Usually wars start as a result of gradual escalations and disagreement, but this was fueled by one specific event, sparked by that one event. Thirdly, it was foretold that streams of blood will flow like the water of a rivulet, which demonstrates that this was going to be resulting in a lot of bloodshed. And this is not mere poetic hyperbole. This was actually fulfilled word for word as well, because it's recorded in books of history that witnesses say at Gallipoli the water was red 50 yards out. These are eyewitness accounts of how much bloodshed took place in this horrendous catastrophe. Fourthly, it was mentioned that the sky will attack with a drawn sword. And this prophecy was made in 1905 at a time when the Wright brothers hadn't even finished building their first fully functional aircraft. Little did they know the immense effect that their invention was going to have on this war. And aerial warfare, first at a very grand scale, took place in World War I. Sixthly, in relation to this war, another specific mention which we find, and I quote, is that as a result of this war, I quote, "the children of Israel will be relieved." And so we see the Balfour Declaration issued in 1917, in which the British government declared support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the then Ottoman Empire. But after this came the most distinct element of the prophecy. It singled out one man in particular. The prophecy said, and I quote, "Even the Tsar at that hour will be in a pitiable state." The Tsar of Russia at the time of this prophecy was the richest man alive. He ruled over a sixth of the world's landmass. He commanded the largest foot army and claimed that he had divine support. So he was in good standing at that time, very good standing. However, this was prophesied. And accordingly, in World War I, when this prophecy was made during the course of this global calamity, in 1917, a series of unfortunate events brought the Tsar back to his capital to quell growing dissatisfaction, and on his way he was forced to abdicate. He was put to house arrest for months, and his family, the family was brutally executed before each other's eyes. And their corpses were even ruined by the communists who brought about the revolution at that time. So he did go through a very miserable state, despite the fact that no one could have guessed this in advance. It's truly mind-boggling how all the unique elements of this highly falsifiable prophecy were fulfilled in a single event. Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, who led a spiritual community from a remote Indian village, said this prophecy would prove his truth as a recipient of revelation from the unseen. And for me, it has. This and his countless other fulfilled prophecies, just like those found in the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, lay down strong evidence for me for the existence of God, and they at least warrant further study. Catrin, how much time am I looking at?
2 minutes.
Okay, all right. So, at the end, all I would like to say is, I'm not here to make any of you believe in 20 minutes that God exists. But if I can convince you that maybe there is some evidence which you have yet to explore, and have you perhaps reflect over the possibility of the existence of God in light of some of the things that I've mentioned, then I shall be content. Now, the greatest evidence for the existence of God is when we finally experience God for ourselves, when He begins to communicate with us at a personal level, but when He answers our prayers. But in order for us to develop that relationship, we have to exert an effort to find Him through prayer first, in the same way that we exert an effort to attain knowledge in other fields of study. So I urge you, take up my challenge, not for my sake, for your own sake, because if God does exist, then you ought to know. You owe it to yourselves to know. And if He doesn't exist, then all right. But at least if He does, you should know about it. So all I ask is pray to God. Oh God, if there is a God, I don't know if there is, but if there is, then manifest yourself to me through some sign. Communicate with me. And if you don't, then I'm absolved of my responsibility to you. Put the onus on God to manifest His being to you, but be sincere in the search, because that is required in any investigation. We have a search which is clouded by preconceived notions can never bring about fruits. And you are the best judge of that. Whether, if you're being honest to yourselves, then you know that. I can't judge you, no one can judge you. Only you can judge yourselves. So take it up and see where it leads you, and maybe you will communicate, and maybe you will feel God in your life as well, and find proof and evidence of His existence through His communication with you. Because the Holy Quran says in a verse that those who exert a sincere effort to find God, God reveals Himself to those people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayyaz. We're going to spend about 20 minutes talking between our two speakers. And I think I'll start. One of the things that you said, Arif, was that you didn't know exactly what evidence was going to be presented. So having heard what Ayyaz had to say, his focus being on prophecy, Prophet Muhammad predicting the advent of modern transport, specific claims made by Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, the founder of Ayyaz community. What do you make of his evidence?
Okay, good. Well, I think that there were various sources of evidence that Ayyaz mentioned. So that there was the existence of testimony, there was the existence of worldwide belief in a more or less common deity, there was the existence of prophecy, he also mentioned personal experience, so that there are at least those four categories. But you're right, that he focused to a large extent on prophecy. I do want to say a bit about that. In the case of the prophecies of Muhammad, so he foresaw the bus, for instance, and the aeroplane, and so on. One thing I would say is that we have to ask whether any such prophecies also exist in the secular world by people who are clearly not divinely inspired. And if we look, for instance, at the fact that, let's say, to take an example almost completely at random, Democritus, hundreds of years before Christ, endorsed the atomic hypothesis, which it took us, 2,500 years to verify. Somebody might say, well, he could have had no way at all of knowing about that had he not been divinely inspired. But of course, Democritus took a very sensible view of these things and would be the last person to claim to be thus inspired. Another example might be Leonardo da Vinci, who not only foresaw, but actually designed in great detail, for instance, helicopters and parachutes and various other things. It wasn't just he said, oh, it uses fire and it's got something going round on the top. He drew in detail exactly how it was that a helicopter or parachute is supposed to work. Now, if Muhammad had come up with something like that, like if instead of saying it eats fire, he'd said it's got a carburetor and this is what it looks like, that would have been impressive. In the case of the other prophecy concerning the First World War, I was sort of thinking to myself whether there was any period in the 19th century or early 20th century during which it would have been false to say that a big war is coming that's going to destroy an empire and there's going to be rivers of blood. So, for instance, anybody who'd said between 1776 and 1789 concerning that, somebody could interpret that as having been about the American Revolution and the ultimate collapse of the British Empire, though that happened much later. Anybody who said it before 1789, would have, between, say, 1789 and 1815, or any period before that, could have been referring to the French Revolution, the subsequent wars, and the collapse of the entire European order during that period. Anybody who'd said it in the years leading up to 1848 would have been referred to a huge variety of things that we all know about. Anybody who'd said it up to the 1860s could have been talking about the American Civil War. To 1870 could have been talking about the Franco-Prussian War and the birth of a new empire. And then we've got the First World War and the Second World War and so on. So it would be quite hard to find periods in which a prophecy delivered with the sorts of level of vagueness that the initial parts of it were delivered with would be false. On the specific things that you mentioned, the issue is not as though Russia was some kind of place of peace and stability in 1905. They just had a big war with Japan, as I recall, and there had been sort of anarchist stirrings for quite a while before that, in the late 19th century. So it's not as though, of all the powerful countries in the world, Britain, Prussia, Russia, the United States, China, Russia would have been the last place you would have expected to last, perhaps. The next thing is concerning the sudden occurrence of the First World War. Well, there was a build-up to the First World War for a long period before 1914, and it's true that there was a spark, that is to say, one event that started it. But you could say just about any war was started with some occasion, and if it hadn't been that, it would have been something else. There were, of course, all the great power rivalries that had been going on ever since the late 19th century that everyone knew about. And it wouldn't have taken a great deal of insight or acumen to have predicted that there was going to be some sort of war arising out of that. Again, as with Muhammad, if he'd really wanted people to believe to believe that he was divinely inspired, surely the sensible thing to do would have been to say, there will be a revolution in Russia in October 1917, and the Tsar and his family will be killed in Ekaterinburg such and such number of months later by Bolsheviks. That would have been impressive, again. As it is, not so much. So, I mean, putting it in terms of the criterion that I mentioned, I'll stop in a moment. We have to ask, how likely is it we would have observed these things if they had been divinely inspired, and how likely is it that we would have observed these things if they hadn't been divinely inspired? And my claim is, given their relative non-specificity and the relative ease with which a divinely inspired person could have been much, much more specific, I think the nature of these prophecies is such that they actually speak against the divine origin of them.
Ayyaz, did you want to respond? Why are they so vague? Why don't we have these specifics?
Well, I can see that perhaps if the Prophet of Islam had said that a time would come when there would be an airplane and it would have engines fitted to its wings made by Rolls-Royce, and they would take off from London Heathrow Airport and land at Dubai International and go to other airports of the world, and the companies that would use them would be KLM, Singapore Airlines, and something else. That would be really specific, right? But we have to take into account that these words were not present in the vocabulary at the time, right? I mean, there's no such word for the combustion engine because there was no combustion engine. There was no such word in the Arabic idiom to describe these things with such specificity. So what the Prophet of Islam did was describe them as best as he could with the language that was available to him. And I think the donkey is definitely representative of a form of transport. And the other aspects of the prophecy which have been mentioned are pretty specific. And let's say if we talk about World War I being predictable, and anyone with astute political acumen being able to come up with these predictions, that too, I think I've read the historical account around that era. And many historians say that World War I was very unpredictable. Even some historians have written, I can show you the references, not a problem. Some historians even say that until June of 1914, World War I was not as imminent as many people thought. And when hostilities broke out, many people were genuinely shocked. And historians even write that this could have been solved. It was not something which was a long way coming. I mean, the Russo-Japanese War and the state of the Tsar, which perhaps, that's also a valid point. I mean, if there was enough evidence for someone to gauge that the Tsar is starting to move his position of stability and it's looking like he's going to be in big trouble soon, and he prophesied that would not be too special, no doubt. I agree with you. But when we take into account that that's not the only thing which is mentioned, right? I mean, the prophecy states that there would be a global calamity. It would be global. It would be sparked suddenly, and you would have a large amount of bloodshed as a result of those hostilities, and you would have aerial warfare, and the relieving of the children of Israel, which is also pretty specific, and it did happen in conjunction to the war. And then on top of that, when he says that, and with all of these various individual constituents being fulfilled together, another way that you can identify whether that event is the event I'm talking about, it is that as a result of that war, the Tsar would also crumble. Now, if the Tsar prophecy was fulfilled a day after the end of World War I, he would be proven false. And I would agree that that prophecy would be false. But the fact that all of these individual constituents took place together demonstrates that it wasn't just simple guesswork.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
I'm going to move on slightly.
Okay.
It's very specific because we're dealing with a prophecy of such specific detail. I want to ask you a bit of a more broad question. One that you posed, Arif, is that because you discussed what would convince you otherwise, and the whole nature of this discussion is what can we learn from each other. What would convince you that your belief is wrong?
What would prove to me that God's belief that I hold is wrong was if these prophets of God, which I believe to be truthful messengers from God, if they came, if they made prophecies, and it was a best out of 10 type thing, where they made 100 prophecies, and no, not even a best out of 10. I would even go so far as saying that, let's say Mirza Ghulam Ahmad or any other prophet, let's take Mirza Ghulam Ahmad for example, if he made 1,000 prophecies and 999 of them came true, and one was false, that would be enough evidence for me to prove that this guy is false. Because if it's God that we're talking about who gives this knowledge, if he does exist, then he's got to get it on the bullseye every single time. And we find in these prophecies, I mean, there's a whole book of revelations of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, which is recorded in book form. I can give it to you, you can take a look at it. And I've gone through that entire book, and each and every prophecy is fulfilled. If I found even a single prophecy which was false, then I would state that person's claim is false.
Are there any concern in the future?
Sorry?
Are there any concern in the future so we can find out?
Well, if they were any concerning the future from now, you wouldn't know until they were fulfilled, right? So that's why it's more apt to distinguish prophecies that have been fulfilled, which were foretold before the event. I mean, we could talk about, let's say...
But is there not something, Arif's asking for something that you could grab hold of now and say, okay, this is going to happen at this point. Let's see if it does.
Right, well, but that's fine. I mean, I agree with that. But how would that prove whether the prophecy was true? Because let's say if Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, for example, claimed that such and such thing would happen, let's say in 10, 15, 20 years, maybe after we leave this world, how would that prove to us that the prophecy is true? In my understanding, the proof of a prophecy is one which has been fulfilled, and you can objectively test whether it fits the criteria or not, right? That's why I presented prophecies which don't concern future claims, but which were made in advance and have been fulfilled, and we can check and see whether those things did actually occur as they were foretold in advance. That's
well, one reason was just to take examples. I mean, an example would be Nostradamus, who made a very large number of prophecies, right, which were fulfilled by the sounds of it, with as much vividness as the ones that you describe. Then he made other ones about the future that turned out not to happen.
But that's my point, right? That's exactly my point, that the difference between Nostradamus and a true prophet of God is that he made a plethora of prophecies. Some of them perhaps have been fulfilled, but even if one is unfulfilled or is false, then that's enough to say that the person is a liar. But in the case of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, and I believe in the case of other prophets, each and every prophecy has to be true. Otherwise, it's enough to warrant you writing off the whole thing, right?
Arif, why do you think that so many highly educated people who go on the search that Ayyaz suggested that everyone takes do find God, do find answers, do find someone that speaks back to them?
Yeah, I mean, it may be that there are different answers for different kinds of persons, and of course I would accept that very intelligent, very educated people have strong religious belief. No sensible person, I think, could deny that. Part of it might be to do with the sorts of emotional habits and backgrounds that they have, for instance, and it gives people a feeling of security of one sort or another. Part of it might be that it offers them the best answer to certain questions. So people might ask about what was the beginning of the universe, and where did I come from, where did the whole universe come from? And it might seem to them, I think it's a fallacy, but it might seem to them that that's the best possible answer to that question. Part of it might be a misinterpretation of certain kinds of feelings that they have. So you can have special feelings, or what you might call transcendental feelings at particular times of your life, which can be interpreted in a way that particularly invites religious types of description. And something like that might be true of Dionysiac festivals, for instance. So there are various sorts of causes, that might bring about this sort of belief. What I don't accept is that any of them are of the type that I would think reasonably are called, empirical evidence for these things. In the case of many people who are not, who are not educated or not intelligent, or lived in earlier and barbaric times, in those cases they may well have had what they thought was evidence for these things, but we fortunately do not live in those times.
When Ayyaz compares feelings of love, of fear, things that we believe in so strongly and we can't evidence, what's your response to that? How is this different? Why do we say? Yeah. Why can you say so strongly that God isn't true and these are?
Yeah. Well, no, I agree completely with Ayyaz when he says that of course we ought to believe in things that we can't directly see or feel. Absolutely, we all do. For instance, dark matter is a good example of that. But I think the answer to that is that it goes back to the answer to the questions that I mentioned, which is, what would we expect to observe if it was there, and what would we expect to observe if it wasn't there? And that's our reason. So why do we expect, what would we expect to observe if this person was having such and such emotions, and what would we expect to observe if they weren't? And that can be evidence of a sort, empirical evidence from people's behavior and so on, that they have feelings and that they have emotions, even though we can't directly observe them. So it certainly is possible to have legitimate evidence for things that you can't observe directly. I don't think anybody needs to dispute that. The question is whether a divine creator of the universe, who orders the course of history, and who is the source of all moral and political authority, is among those things. And I don't know what the case is for that.
I agree with you too. I mean, if proof for the existence of God as presented by theists is just because thousands of people believe it, that's no proof. I mean, if 1,000 people told me that they saw a dancing elephant outside with wings, I wouldn't believe it, because you have to test the testimony, which is, I mean, just because you feel something is right is no evidence for its truthfulness, right? So the fact that there are so many adherents to a faith and they devoutly follow their religion is no evidence. So too, let's say, for example, you mentioned scripture, right? Let's say if God wasn't there, if he didn't exist, we'd still probably have a similar document. I agree with that too, in the sense that just the mere existence of scripture is not enough for it to be true. I mean, because anyone can write a book, right? But the book should speak for itself. It should contain, as you mentioned, and I agree with you, it should contain prophecies. It should mention things of the past, some of which, when I say some of which have been fulfilled, I mean all of the ones that relate to the past must be fulfilled, and perhaps contain information of future times as well, so that you can objectively test. I mean, if a holy scripture has a prophecy, or many prophecies, and you objectively analyze that and see that the claim was made prior to its occurrence and they were fulfilled, that demonstrates that it's not just a book written by an individual who just did guesswork. That would demonstrate that God does exist and shows the truthfulness of his existence by revealing knowledge of the unseen, which no other individual could have gouged. But I think it's necessary that the prophecy shouldn't be so vague that it can be applied to anything and be completely unfalsifiable. It needs a degree of specificity, but it can't be so specific that it's falsifiable. Like, for example, if I said that the good friend who's standing there at the camera is going to walk over and shake his hand, the next person there, that's not a prophecy, because he could walk over and do what I just said, right? So if it's so specific that anyone can fulfill it through their own actions, that's not a prophecy. It has to be such that cannot be fulfilled by human hands, and it should have a slight degree of vagueness, so that it's not completely unfalsifiable, and also it should not be so vague that it can be applied to anything, right?
Yeah, no, see, there's where I disagree, because I think the important thing is that it be as specific as you like, and that, having something which is not so unspecific that people can't say it's completely meaningless, but it's not so specific that you can really put it to the test at a particular point. It just gives you enough room to play. It gives you kind of play to get out of problematic cases. So, for instance, if Jesus said, some of the people alive today will see the end of the world, which I believe he did say. No, that seems pretty obviously falsified hypothesis, okay? But of course there are going to be people who say, well, you can interpret that as meaning something else, and because it's not quite specific enough. Really impressive cases would be the special theory of relativity, predicted with a precision that not even Newton's theory, which was spectacular, managed, the behavior of Mercury. And it was completely specific, and that's why that theory is so well confirmed.
Why would someone divinely guided not give us specifics?
Well, first,
and leave everyone open to.
You see, because then what is the limit that we set? Let's say the prophecies are specific enough that they can't be fiddled with to be applied to all situations, but they're also specific enough that they directly refer to a single event. That's the line that we have to draw. I mean, if it's so specific that, as I mentioned, anyone could fulfill it, then it's no longer and it no longer warrants any spiritual reward to accept the validity of that statement either. I mean, we have to. I believe that there is a certain degree of spiritual reward in believing in God, not without evidence, not without any rational cause, of course, but I can see the sun so clearly, right? It's not a matter of me, I wouldn't be worthy of any reward for accepting something that everybody can see. So there is a degree of vagueness which God does leave in prophecy, so that there is a degree of spiritual reward which ought to be had from believing in that. But I stress again, I agree with you. If a prophecy is so vague that it can be applied to multiple situations, that's not a prophecy. If it's so specific that it can be fulfilled by anyone who knows the wording of that prophecy, like for example, you mentioned that such and such person at the World War would kill so and so person, that assassination would then result in the start of a world war and all of that. That is something which can be fulfilled by human hands. So you have to have a fine line between these two extremes. So the thing is, it can't be too vague, it also can't be too specific. Because then then what is the limit that you will draw for what is specific? Let's say I say, no, if the prophecy was more specific, I would be happy. But maybe the next person would say, no, it's not specific enough. It needs to be more specific. So you'd never come to an agreement. So what I believe is that a prophecy is specific enough that it can be judged and tested to see whether it applies on a single event or not.
But leave some room for disbelief.
Yes.
Why?
Because if the prophecy is word for word, then there would be no spiritual benefit in accepting it. And there would be you wouldn't be worthy of any reward for believing in God or accepting the prophecy and then attaining a spiritual reward for it. But that doesn't mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that for the sake of spiritual reward, prophecies should be so blind and so vague that they can apply to anything. I agree with you there.
I feel like this section could go on for quite some time, so I'm going to stop and ask for questions from the audience. There are some roving microphones. I'm going to take one at a time and see how that works, but don't answer until it comes to you. I'll start in the middle here. You can just tell us who your question is to, or if it's for both of the speakers.
Okay, thank you. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, the Holy Quran itself speaks about a lot of prophecies by people who are not prophets. And I'll give only the example of Munajjim Fir'aun, which is the wizard of Pharaoh, who said that basically Moses, somebody gonna appear in this season and he will overthrow you and he will kill you. And it happened.
Is that written in the Quran? Sorry? Is that what you mentioned? That's written in the Quran?
Surah Musa, yeah. Musa, Surah of Musa. Let's speak about the false prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad.
Quran, I haven't seen that prophecy, but anyway, okay. Please continue.
Okay. There is a prophecy of the Prophet that he said that basically it would be 73 branches of Islam. We still didn't see any 73 branches of Islam, and one of them would be the true one. He said basically in the Quran, Surah Fussilat, the 9th verse, he said that earth was created in the 2 days, and then what's on earth, all the animals and all that created in 4 days, and then
I've read the Quran.
سوى الأرض في يومين ثم سوى فيها قوتها للسائلين في أربعة
أيام. Keep your questions just a little bit shorter.
So sorry. So and he said many that the caliphate will always be in the Quraysh, and we'd always see in Quraysh as well. There's so many false prophecies, so it's about the ratio. I think if you made a lot of prophecies, thank you.
So your argument is that there were false prophecies?
Lots of them, yeah.
Yes.
So I've studied the Quran for over 10 years. I did a master's in it in the university that I studied, and I have to humbly but very respectfully state that none of the things that you mentioned are stated in the Holy Quran. I've read the Quran, I've never heard of these prophecies, they're not mentioned there. There is no false prophecy in the Holy Quran, because as I mentioned, if there was, then that would be sufficient evidence to write off the whole lot. But after the event, I mean, you can show me those prophecies and we can discuss that, but they're not written in the Quran.
There's just one very clear, like we created you male and female, and we know now that there's intersex and there's gender dysphoria. everyone knows we created humanity.
I mean, I think right now we're talking, I think you are adding words which are not in the Arabic text. They're not written in the Quran, and we can talk about that. I mean, that's my simple answer, that the things that you mentioned are not mentioned in the Holy Quran.
Arif, can you come in on this one? I can't tell you the answer to that.
Well, no, I mean,
so that puts me in a difficult position. I can't tell you.
No, I believe there are many people who think that the Quran contains false statements. I believe every book contains false statements, and it wouldn't surprise me the slightest to learn that the Quran did, for instance, concerning sexual generation and how there can be asexual generation. But I'm not an expert on Arabic or on the text, so I wouldn't want to say any more than just what I've heard about that.
Ayyaz, and you argue that every word is completely true.
Yes, I believe so, and I also I feel as if I know so. I could be wrong, but until now I have not come across a prophecy of the Holy Quran which has proven to be false. But I'm always open if someone wants to show me one. If you want to show me one after the event, I'm more than happy to hear that.
I will let you guys have that discussion after. Another question. This gentleman here.
Thanks a lot. You mentioned, sorry, is it Arif? Yeah. You mentioned that if different parts of the world, out of a cloud, different voices came down. Currently, there's a spirit entity called Kryon, Kryon, and the sort of the westernized, he talks through a person, and the person's name is Lee Carroll. And this is happening currently in about, I think it's 7 or 9 locations currently worldwide. It just so happens that about 10, 15 years ago, he predicted ISIS, and out of interest sake, ISIS is going to pull the whole world together. So that is happening, and that can, in time, be verified. So that's one thing. On the, just the last one, you were very impressed with the helicopter, Da Vinci. How could where did the information and the data come from that he could foresee a helicopter? And is that maybe a higher entity that controls that?
Okay, good. There's 2 things about that. The first thing, concerning the first part of your comment, there's a difference between everyone in the world seeing something and there being reports of certain kinds of divine communication and people making prophecies and so on. And to that, I would with respect say the sort of thing that Hume said, is that whenever anybody informs you of this sort of miracle, you have to ask which of 2 things is likely. Is it more likely that the person is mistaken, or is it more likely that the miracle occurred? We all agree people make mistakes about these things or are otherwise misleading all the time, and miracles occur almost never. So the vast presumption of probability must be against believing testimonies of such sorts of things. In the case of Leonardo da Vinci, I didn't see any evidence to think that it was divinely inspired, that his claim was, his work was divinely inspired, though I suppose if you could say it of anyone, you could say it of someone like him, simply because the human mind is creative, and it is capable of coming up with new things, and thinking of things that no one else has ever thought of before, and that are not found in nature. They're often there by analogies with nature. So it seems to me as though the creativity of the human mind, which psychologists and neurologists are exploring now perhaps more than ever before, is something of which we do have some empirical understanding, and it's something that could one day perhaps explain how, as well as the ordinary inventiveness that we get amongst most people, we get occasionally extraordinary geniuses like Shakespeare or Da Vinci.
No, sorry. So I have to have a question from someone else, sorry. I'm looking for a female hand. There we are, lady there.
Okay, this question's to, is it Ayyaz? You've said that what would falsify religion for you would be a prophecy that was false. What is the difference? What, to your mind, would be the difference between a false prophecy and a prophecy that had yet to be fulfilled? Isn't it always going to be impossible to say a prophecy is false, because you can always say, well, next year it may happen. When the prophet that you spoke about in 1905 made all these predictions, in 1906 were they false? In 1907 were they false? We had to wait. And then you say, oh, yes, here's an event that matches it. But isn't that always going to be the case, that any prophecy, oh, you're just waiting for the event that's going to match it?
No, that's a very good question. You're right. If the whole corpus, if the whole lot, if the whole collection of prophecies were such that, for example, let's take my example, if the only prophecies that I had were such which haven't been fulfilled yet, then that wouldn't be real evidence in favor of my case. But prophets don't just come and make a single prophecy, they come and make many, many prophecies. And you will find that you have to test the number of prophecies which have already been fulfilled, and that demonstrates the existence of God for me. I mean, if a claimant of prophethood came and said that I've made 1,000 prophecies, but just keep waiting, they'll be fulfilled maybe next year, maybe a year after that, then that wouldn't be any true evidence for the truthfulness of his claim. But when a prophet comes and makes so many various prophecies, many of them are fulfilled, even in the lifetime of the prophet. So you will find that that also is very good evidence for the existence of God. I mean, if the entire basis of my claim was only on prophecies which have yet to be fulfilled, then you would be 100% correct, and that wouldn't be real evidence. But there is many, many examples of prophecies which are fulfilled in the time of the Prophet of God, which are fulfilled after his demise, which are fulfilled in coming ages, and then continue to be fulfilled. So we have to judge the prophecies that we do have and which are fulfilled. And that demonstrates the existence of God.
Okay, can I have a question for Arif, please? This gentleman here.
Hi, my question is that, proof by induction, that's a very basic thing in mathematics. The way I see the philosophy of belief in Islam is that it's like proof by induction, where first you assume something, and then you carry on until the very end and see whether it's true or not, or whatever result you're trying to get to. With Islam, it's something similar. And the first assumption is that God does exist, and then you try to find out whether the beliefs are something that are beneficial, or whether the beliefs are true, whether God does exist afterwards. And if all the details are given of a certain prophecy, such specificity, then there's no point of going through the whole proof by induction, the whole proof. Then what's the benefit of going through once you already have the answer in front of you? If a statement is made beforehand that such and such is going to happen, then you ought to accept it anyway. What would you say about that?
Okay, thanks. I think a couple of points. And the first thing I'd say is I think it might be misleading to compare that procedure to mathematical induction, which is what happens where if you suppose that the number 0 has a property, and you show that if any number has that property, so does the next one, then you can infer that all of them have it. That's mathematical induction, and seems to me to bear only a remote relation to the kind of process that you described. Now, how does it relate to what I was saying about evidence? Well, I suppose in a way there's a kind of relation, because the way you test theories against evidence is by suppose they're true, how likely is it that we would see what we observe? Suppose that they're false, how likely is it that we would see what we observe? And that's, I think, the best account of how scientific inquiry and evidence gathering either does or should proceed. Now, in the issue, so at a very abstract level, I guess there's not that much disagreement between us. On the point about prophecy, I suppose the reason that I was concerned about specificity was in a way something that an earlier questioner encapsulated, which is that just about any prophecy is going to come true eventually. Even if it's not completely vague, it's still going to come true eventually. So it's just not very impressive if they're not very specific. That's the point. Whereas you would have thought that in the divine case it would be, it certainly could be more impressive if it were, as it could have been, more specific. And then the other thing you said, which was, I think you said that we ought to believe it anyway, but I wasn't quite clear what the reason was for thinking.
No, I'm
that.
saying where we ought to, if a statement is made which is very specific about some event,
yes,
then we ought to believe it, because if that has happened, then that's it. There's no kind of reward for it. There is no benefit of going through the proof by induction of the whole idea which you, going through the numbers, because it's already there.
Well, I agree with the point if the point is that if one method of proof were completely decisive, other ones wouldn't be necessary. But what I'm claiming is we not only have none that are decisive, but none that even are remotely anything close to being conclusive.
Okay.
Could I just make a quick comment? Is
Yeah, sure.
Is that allowed? The comment that you made, Arif, that every prophecy is going to be fulfilled eventually at some point or the other. I don't know if I agree with that, because, I mean, there are some prophecies which are yet to be fulfilled, right? But we can't disregard, right? But we can't disregard the prophecies which are fulfilled, right? And which we can objectively test. And if we can find a prophecy which has already been fulfilled, or you could disprove it, then that would be evidence or enough for us to decide whether the man was false or true. I mean, you can't just disregard all of the prophecies which have been made and which have been fulfilled and which were beyond the scope of the available data of that person at the time, and say that the whole thing is wiped clean just because there are certain prophecies which haven't been fulfilled yet. I mean, if the whole argument was on the basis of only prophecies which have yet to be fulfilled, then that would be true. Then that's not evidence, but that's not what I'm saying, right?
I think one way you could have got around that question would have been just, the Mirza could have got around the question would have been to have given dates. Just saying, in 1917 in October, there will be a revolution in Russia. That would be really impressive.
But how can we forget all of the other specific aspects of the prophecy, all of which took place exactly at the same time simultaneously? That is, for me, it's evidence. I mean, it was pretty specific that when the great calamity would happen, you would have bloodshed, you would have a sudden spark. It would be such that the children of Israel would be relieved as a result of it. And also, as a result of it, the Tsar would also crumble. I mean, if any single one aspect of this took place before or after, then you would be right in saying that the prophecy was just a vague shot in the dark. And I would agree with you, but that's not the case, right?
Okay. Question from the front.
Could I ask about the problem of evil? Because the problem of evil contradicts the attributes of God. Would you say this is evidence for there not being a God?
Yes. I mean, the argument is sometimes presented as a logical argument. That is to say that God's attributes are logically inconsistent with the evil that we observe in the world around us. I didn't present it in that way because one of the attributes that's involved in that argument is omnipotence. And I didn't want to assume that God was completely omnipotent, but simply that he was very powerful and powerful enough to create the universe. I would have thought such a God would have it within his power to stop at least one of the African children who died last year of malaria from dying of malaria. And I can't see what possible good that child's death could have done.
That is often...
Yeah, no. It is definitely a question which agitates many minds, and it's a good question. But, I mean, you mentioned malaria, for example, right? I remember I had malaria. I went to Africa a couple of years ago, and I was bedridden. And it was the worst experience of my life, but thankfully I survived because there was medical help available to me. Now, that is the case with many of the other children who die every year of malaria. I mean, there is suffering in the world, I agree. But much of the suffering can be removed if humanity plays a larger part in alleviating the suffering of those people. I mean, there is enough money in the world, there is enough power for all of the great superpowers who take so much pride in their power and their money to make sure that medicine is available to those who are less fortunate. But simply, the fact is that they couldn't care less. And that's the tragedy. Much of the suffering that we see in the world is man-made. And I mean, we have enough food to go around so that there would be no poverty. But I mean, I'm not an expert of economics, but I understand that in order to keep the supply-demand chain low, thousands of tons of wheat and food is burnt or thrown into the ocean. I mean, that could go around and remove a lot of suffering. But unfortunately, it doesn't. Now,
why does
God allow it?
What
Why does God allow it? Okay, let's take God out of the equation. Would suffering come to an end? Right? We'd still have suffering, whether God was there or not. So the existence of suffering does not disprove the existence of God. At most, what it proves is that if there is a God, then he's pretty cruel. But I mentioned that much of the suffering is man-made. And suffering isn't in itself an independent entity. Suffering is the result of being able to perceive pleasure. I mean, in order for us to experience pleasure, we must have an equal degree of perception to suffering. It's like there's no such thing as dark, it's just the absence of light, right? But let's look at it from another aspect. For many people, the loss of their child is the worst thing that could possibly happen to them. And the reason for that is because they take an equal amount of pleasure in that child being in their life. So the more you experience pleasure for something, the loss of that is that much worse. I mean, for many people today, we walk out of our home and if I forget my iPhone, I feel like that's an immense degree of suffering because I can't live without my iPhone, and that's the case for many people. But thousands of years ago, they couldn't really care less if they had their iPhones or not, right? So suffering is also a relative thing too, which changes as time goes on.
Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, just briefly. I agree that a good deal of suffering is man-made, but I think a good deal of it also isn't. And it stands as a strong argument whose evidential force remains, in my view, as strong as ever against the benevolence of the supposed creator.
What do you mean by that? That a great deal of suffering isn't man-made?
Well, what I had in mind was that, for instance, let's take Ebola, for instance, which causes people a horrible death. Why is there a disease which causes death in a way that's quite so bad? It could have been very different. Things could have been very different, and it's not man-made that Ebola is so bad as it is. Okay? It's just a matter of nature. So what possible necessity is there for us to live? Because somebody might say if evil is man-made, that it's a necessary evil because it gives us free will. Okay? But the point is there are gratuitous natural ills that couldn't possibly contribute to free will, and which still exist, and which are just what you would expect to exist if the world was indeed the kind of chaotic and unordered place that atheists think it is.
More questions? Gonna go to this lady here in the red top.
I'm sorry to drag it back to the prophecies, but about the need for balance between ones that have been fulfilled and ones that haven't. Is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
Going back to the prophecies and the need for the balance between the ones that have been fulfilled and the ones that weren't, how many years after 1905 did it become reasonable to believe in the person who made these prophecies, and did the people who believed him before that, were they doing it irrationally?
They would have been doing it irrationally if there was no other prophecies which had been fulfilled by that time. And that's why I come back to the same point, that if the entire claim of an individual is on prophecies which have yet to be fulfilled, then he doesn't really give any evidence of truthfulness of his claim. But in the case of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, I presented, for the prophecy which was made in 1905, someone could ask, was it false? You mentioned that. Was it false in 1906, 1907, 1908 until it was fulfilled? No, it wasn't false. It was one that we were waiting to see if it happens or not. But what about... Well, I would say that if a single prophecy, right, was false, then that would be... Right, if a single prophecy, we take into account all of the claims of an individual. He says, I prophesy that this will happen, that will happen, this will take place. And if a single one of those things are false, then that's enough for us to disbelieve. So we have to judge the truthfulness of an individual on the data that we have. The fact that there are prophecies which aren't fulfilled yet, for us to use that to decide that this person is false, whereas he's made other claims which have been fulfilled, which were pretty specific. I'm not sure if that would be a very fair method of judgment.
Can I just comment briefly on that? Because it seems to me that even if all prophecies were fulfilled, there's a variety of competing explanations for that. One of them is religious. One of them might be there's precognition or backwards causality or something. Completely secular hypotheses that would explain true prophecies that have nothing to do with divinity, in which the existence of prophecy does nothing to rule out.
I would agree with you that perhaps precognition is the result of an individual making prophecies, and certain people do use precognition to make accurate statements as well. But I come back to that best out of 10, best out of 1,000 thing. If a person is constantly making prophecies after the other and all of them are fulfilled, I'm not sure if that's just precognition. Because if it's precognition, then you have people like Nostradamus and others who predict certain things. Some of them are fulfilled, some of them are not. Some of them are clearly false. You can judge to test whether they're false or not. I mean, I come back, I as a theist, I take a great burden on myself. And I say, in a humble way, of course, that I challenge anyone, show me a prophecy which hasn't been fulfilled, and I'll agree that that person is false. But I haven't seen one yet.
I think one of the points that the question was making was, at what point do you accept it? If someone follows a religion without any prophecies being fulfilled, are they stupid? Are they blind?
No.
Is there a point at which it becomes testable?
Well, I think that you have to use is probability and the amount of prophecies which are fulfilled. I mean, if an individual has gone on making many prophecies, all of which are fulfilled, to say that I don't know if the next one that he made will be true or not, and therefore I don't agree that he's true, I'm not sure if that's a fair way to go about judging an individual. If every single statement that he's made up until now is true and has been fulfilled, why should we not use that as the evidence, the data that's available to us, and make a choice on the basis of that? Merely on the basis of speculation of the fact that perhaps the next one may not be fulfilled.
Does the fact that you have a very specific prophet to follow, and that most people of faith choose a faith, does that, as Arif argued earlier, discount other people of faith?
Well, as a Muslim...
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. As a Muslim, my religious belief in Islam can only be complete when I accept every single prophet that preceded, right? We don't pick and choose one over the other and say, I believe in this one, but that one was false. I mean, that would not be a correct way of going about making our decision. As a Muslim, I believe, and the Quran teaches this, that in order for my faith to be complete, in order for my religious belief to be complete and acceptable by God, I have to believe in every single prophet of God who came before as well. And that's a very beautiful teaching of universality. It's something which is at odds with sectarianism. I mean, we accept that all prophets are truthful because they all come from the same source, bringing the same message for different times.
But arguing for belief, do you then argue that people that don't accept your version of the belief are wrong? And that someone, who, for example, who doesn't accept all those prophets that you think are necessary for your belief is wrong?
Well, I have the right to believe that my concept is right, my belief is right, but I don't go about throwing statements on other people and their infidelity and telling them that they're hellbound, because that's not my job to do. And I'm really happy that the belief in Islam that I hold, the Quran that I believe in, it teaches me that I'm not to go about passing statements on certain individuals that just because you don't believe my concept of Islam, therefore you're going to hell. I believe in a God that is the God of everybody, and He treats all of us like our children, and it's for God to decide who is going to get a place in His pleasure and displeasure. I know many atheists who are perfectly, wonderfully nice people. Arif is a really nice person. I mean, I say that, that's not a sarcastic comment. I genuinely believe it. There are many people who are very nice, very moral, more moral than certain people who claim to be religious, and I appreciate that. But to say that a certain person is hellbound over the other, that's not my job, and I never make statements like that. And no religious believer should.
You may not want to make the statement, but do you believe that someone who's not of your faith, or not of faith at all, will get the same places in heaven as you do?
I do believe that an individual who isn't Muslim, if God knows his heart to be sincere and truthful, then he will also have a place in heaven, even if he's an atheist.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because, once again, I say that I believe in a universal God. Perhaps a person who is an atheist, he's a very moral person. He's done a great deal of good deeds, and Allah desires to reward him for that. And I believe that God has the right to do that. It's not my job to go around passing fatwas on people, and I don't.
Okay, I've just asked Ayyaz a few supplementary questions. So a question for Arif, please. We'll give it further
It looks
back.
like that last answer was pretty shocking for a few. Atheists in heaven. No, I genuinely believe that. God knows the goodness of everyone's heart, and He decides, not me or some other Maulvi or clergyman.
Can I go right to the back? Because I think I'm leaving the back out.
Assalamu alaikum. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you. This question's for Arif, if I may. I'm going to read it just because I don't want to waste my one question. So, Arif, if there was a man sitting to your left who began to give you prophecies, and you lived with him for many years, and over that time period he gave tens of thousands of prophecies, and each one was fulfilled in your life, again and again and again. And then he said to you, live like me, follow my spiritual path, and you will also receive revelation from God. And you do follow that path, and the same revelation is shown to you again and again and again. Every time these signs and revelation are being true. If this happened, would you accept God? And then additionally, if I may, if so, we invite you to live with us for some time, and inshallah, you will see these signs. Not necessarily me personally, but people more spiritual than me.
Well, thank you for the invitation. The first thing I would say is, of course, it would depend on what the prophecy was. I mean, if the prophecy was something like every Monday he said tomorrow's going to be Tuesday, and every Tuesday he said tomorrow's going to be Wednesday, so carry that on for 10,000 days, that wouldn't be impressive. If he said every Monday he said tomorrow you should invest in X share, and then on Tuesday he said tomorrow you should invest in Y share, then I'd be very willing to spend a lot of time with this with this person, and would pay a lot of money in order to learn his wisdom. So it does kind of depend on what the prophecy is, and going back to an earlier comment, how specific it is. Now, in cases where such things were shown to happen and were very specific, that would, as I conceded, indeed be evidence for these claims. I would say, adherents of most religions claim that their founders made a vast range of true prophecies. All of them are true. Okay? There are many religions of which their adherents say that. I would be spoilt for choice in a way, because there's you, and then there would be somebody else from another religion saying the same thing, and someone else from another religion saying the same thing.
My question was, if it happened to you, not somebody else, if it happened to you.
Yep.
Sorry.
I think the answer is this: how specific, which seems to be a point of difference.
It depends on what the prophecy was and how specific it was.
How specific for you?
For example, if it said, this share will rise 25 pence tomorrow, if it was something like that, the answer is yes.
So the founder of Islam, Ahmediyyat, was the promised Messiah, peace be upon him. And he had there's a book called Tajkira, which was very persuasive for me personally and has been for many others. And he talks of financial matters. He says that in a couple of days' time, something will arrive in the post and it'll have 21 rupees in it. So very similar to your financial suggestion. And even that very minute detail would happen. And he kept on doing it. And he didn't only tell it to Muslims, he told it to Hindus and to Sikhs, and to those who didn't believe. So that's the type of scenario I'm talking about. And that is the type of faith which Ayyaz, as an Ahmadi Muslim, and myself, God willing, seek to follow. And also for the whole audience, that is the claim which we bring. Sorry, thank you very much. Pardon me.
Okay, well, can I just say briefly on that? I mean,
you can respond.
There is a distinction between seeing a prophecy for yourself and hearing reports of prophecies. I mean, it may well be, for instance, just as in the case of miracles that we discussed earlier, you have to ask yourself with some of these things, how likely is it that this person got this right, or how likely is it that the story has been embellished at some point in the last 100 years? Embellishments happen all the time. Prophecies of that accuracy and specificity, not mixed with wrong ones, happen very rarely. So I think we should draw the conclusion that in this case there may well have been embellishments.
Can I just say something which maybe might make it easier for Arif? I mean, yeah, the question comes about that, well, should I follow this or that or this doctrine? Which route should I take? I think it's sufficient for you to not take any route and believe in any scripture or any religious affiliation to a certain group of people, and just delve deep within yourself and pray that if there is a God, I don't know if there is, there probably isn't, but anyway, let's be neutral and say that if there is a God, then I need some proof of your existence, not empty arguments and stories, right? I need some proof in my life where you tell me something, and if it's fulfilled, maybe even pray to God that He tells you how the share price will rise tomorrow or something. I mean, why not? Why should we limit God? Go ahead and do that even, right? And I'm sure that God will definitely express Himself to you where you know that, oh, that's just not chance.
Arif, one thing that people often say, I've had said to me enough times anyway, is that they wished they believe. Is there any part of you that, however much you disbelieve, wishes it were true?
Yeah, it would be great if it were true. I really don't want to die and then nothing to happen afterwards. And I would really like there to be some meaning to the history of the world and some meaning to human life. That would be great if that were true. But then when I was 8 years old, it would be great if Santa Claus existed. So of course, there's complete disconnection between how nice it would be if something were true and whether it is true.
I think that's a wonderful thing to highlight. I think that goes to show the sincerity that you have. That if it's true, that's wonderful. Why wouldn't I believe in it? But you have to take that path. You have to exert somewhat of an effort to find out whether it is there or not. And maybe not just say that, well, Santa Claus was great too, and God knows if God exists. I mean, like I said, if God is there, then it's His duty and responsibility to show Himself to you. If the sincere search is there, if the unbiased nature is there, and if the correct method is there. And I think that a person as open-minded as you seem you are would have no problem in doing that.
So Ayyaz believes that if you search sincerely, you will find. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Is there anyone here who feels like they have searched and have maybe not come up with that, who'd like to speak to Ayyaz? This gentleman here on the front here.
Yeah, that's timely. I was going to ask about transcendent experience because it seldom comes up in these discussions, and yet it seems to be the cornerstone of faith. You know, often it seems to me that often the religious have such strong conviction because of their transcendent experiences that they'll bend logic and everything else. Just you know, a lot of your arguments seem, you know, quite circular to me, but you know, that's just how it is. So I think what never gets discussed is the fact that we atheists have them too, you know, and you can go on deep journeys of meditation and so on. We all have transcendent experiences when you're on mountaintops or listening to music or, you know, in love or having sex or whatever it is. So do you put all yours down to God, or do you allow some of them to be... Well, I think and I think it links to what Arif said about the human mind. You know, it's an amazing device that processes massive amounts of information about each other, about the flows and trajectories of human affairs and all the rest of it. And we never seem to discuss that. And I wonder if you allow for the possibilities that that's what causes all of the wacky things that go on inside your head.
Well, I think that's a wonderful question. You're right. There must be, if God is going to express Himself, if He does exist, to someone who's searching for Him, it's got to be in a way that can't just be singled out as the odd psychological or precognitive experience that could be no different from the experience of another person. I mean, if an individual, everybody has their own requirements on what constitutes good enough belief or good enough effort that there is God. And I believe that if an individual prays sincerely, then God will show him those expressions of His existence as many times as he needs to be certain, and in the form that he needs to be certain. I mean, if you ask me, how do I know that I love my son? which is something I experience inside of me. There's no substantive way I can express that, but I know. And you know, everybody knows. So you have to be that best judge. That's what I mentioned in my talk. And it's not within my domain to describe what would constitute enough evidence for a certain individual. That's between you and God, if he does exist. And only you can be the best judge of that. I mean, if someone tells me, how do you know you love your wife? I don't know how I love my wife. I love her. And that's the case with many emotions that we feel. We are the best judge of what we feel.
Can I just respond to that? I think a lot of us would say it's only when you chase out the little shreds of almost hope that religion is actually true, and you chase out dualism. I don't know if you know what that is in philosophical terms, but you chase out the belief in dualism, go all out for a materialist explanation, a physicalist explanation of what's going on. Read great literature like Virginia Woolf or whatever it is, listen to some great music, read Daniel Dennett for your philosophy, and you'll actually break through to a completely different sort of set of experiences. But my sense is that's all. Consciousness is moving towards that.
I agree with you that there can be experiences which are caused by the human mind. I mean, I find that when I eat too much before I go to sleep, I have strange dreams. And that is a psychological thing which happens. It happens to everybody. But the question is that our experience perhaps could be the production of our mind. It could be some other thing. It could be God, it could be our own mind. But that's why I believe that God sends prophets of God as signposts who demonstrate the existence of God through the fulfillment of their prophecies, which I believe are pretty specific. And when prophets of God come, they demonstrate the existence of God through the prophecies that they make. That's like their resume. They demonstrate through people that we do actually have a communion with God. God speaks to us, and now we're telling you something which God has told us of the future, and it will be fulfilled, and it is fulfilled. And then once they establish that credibility through their spiritual resumes, then they give us a course which we should follow. And that's the case with even teachers. I mean, we all start as students. I know that Arif is a very expert lecturer of philosophy, but he too, like all of us, started as students who just trusted our teachers. We learned from them, we followed the guideposts that they gave us to acquire knowledge to such a degree where eventually we become our own authorities, like Arif is. And it's the same thing with spirituality. You have to have a certain degree of trust, not blind faith, just trust in the person that is telling you that I have experienced God, and I'm telling you how you can experience him too if you follow this course. And that's the case with all learning, whether it's secular or spiritual.
Okay, can I have a question for Arif, please? Chap in the middle here.
Hi, thanks both of you for the excellent talk and to the organisers for this event. A lot of theists put forward sort of their own, on a personal level, sort of their acceptance of prayer to their friends as being a proof of God. But of course, that's a bit subjective. Do you think the acceptance of prayer could ever be a sort of objective measure of whether God exists, and whether that could ever be an acceptable form of evidence?
I could see in principle how it might be the case that prayer, the efficacy of prayer could be tested. You could test it by double-blind trials and so on. So here's one group that gets chemotherapy, another group gets prayer, and see which one has the higher mortality rate. And if it turned out that, as a matter of fact, the people who avoid chemotherapy because they think prayer works all end up surviving cancer, and the ones who get chemotherapy, most of them don't, that would be a good reason to show that prayer was efficacious. Now, even that, of course, wouldn't show that there was divine agency behind prayer. It might show some other kinds of effects, including psychological or neurological effects. So I suppose there's two parts in my answer to the question. The first part is, yes, I can certainly imagine there being evidence that prayer works, though I don't think there is any such evidence. And the second thing is that even if that evidence were realised, there would be plenty of hypotheses that are not religious that would also be competitive.
Okay.
Could I make a quick comment, if you don't mind?
You've got a minute.
Okay. So I believe that I believe in a spiritual leader who has a divine connection with God, and his prayers are answered, and I would be willing to, through his blessings, to undertake a test of that nature. by having many, many people, and it's not the first time that I'd be doing it, even the founder of our community proposed this test. He said, let's bring 1,000 ill people, 2,000, 1,000 on one end, on the other end. They all, one group is prayed for, the other is not, and they shouldn't know that someone is praying for them, and we'll test and see where the mortality rate is higher and lower. But nobody took him up on his challenge, and I'd be willing to do that. Sure. Right, no, I'd be willing to do that experiment through us. So bring them. Yeah.
Shows that prayer is harmful. It actually harms your recovery. If you know that someone's praying for you, if you don't know it has no effect, if you know it harms.
Right, so I'd be willing to undertake a sample test of praying, and I would demonstrate. I believe that our prayers and the prayers of our community would definitely have an effect. I can't change that if you're not interested, but the offer is there.
Okay, that's something for after this event. I'll let you guys link as well. We haven't got time for any more questions, but I am going to allow each speaker to have a final minute just to change everyone's mind to the other side. Ayyaz, you can go first.
1 minute.
Yeah.
So I believe that the only form of evidence for the existence of something is not material, and you agree with that. There are other means of testing the truthfulness of something. So there is light. So there is light. So anyway, so I would be willing to, I would be happy to demonstrate that the power of my prayers and our prayers as a community are accepted. And if God does exist, then that is a journey that everyone has to take for themselves. And if they're interested in that journey, then great. If they're not, then that's their decision.
Thanks. I mean, the first thing I want to say, I guess, is to emphasize that on many important matters, perhaps more important than the one we're looking at today, I agree with Ayyaz. I think his own religion has almost none of the defects of every other religion. That is, it emphasizes tolerance, and it emphasizes non-violence and persuasive and rational means of bringing people to religion, and is relatively free of many of the other vices that most religions have, including, for instance, Christianity. The one defect that it shares is falsity, and that was the one that we were talking about today. It seems to me still that there is strong evidence that this religion, like any other, is false. That for any religion, and indeed for many cults as well, you could cite supposed prophecies of this one sort or another, which could be described as having been fulfilled in such and such ways. That there's empirical evidence of the sort that the gentleman mentioned just now against some of the central articles of this belief. The last thing I'd say is look into your own hearts, those of you who believe, and ask yourselves, do I really believe it because I want to believe it, or do I really believe it because that's where the evidence compels me? You all should ask yourselves that question. Thanks.
Thank you very much.